What's up, everybody? Eric July here, head of multimedia for beinglibertarian.com. And today, you've probably heard by now, if you're joining us tonight, we will be having a very special debate in regards to the topic, or the hot topic rather, of borders and in the scope of libertarianism, the state, and whatnot, and all of that good stuff. We are today going to be joined by both Christopher Chase Rachels as well as Larken Rose, and we again will be discussing the topic of borders. And the topic today, resolved: it is sometimes justifiable to use violence to force some people off or keep people off of everywhere in a country where the state has developed or improved upon the land. Chase will be taking the affirmative. Larkin will be taking the negative. Now, I do want to make sure everybody keeps in mind, just for the sake of, I guess, the scope of this rather conversation, is that both of our contestants generally agree when it comes to the end game, when it comes to the ideal standard, and we all, for the most part, would love for a free society, privatized society in which there's not a state that is regulating the border. And I just wanted to make sure that we threw that out there. But with the state, things don't seem to be always a black and a white issue, and that's what we will be discussing today in the scope of libertarianism and the state as it currently stands. Okay, what is the libertarian stance on the borders? Of course, we are joined today by Larken Rose. You do have 10 minutes with your opening statement, and you are taking the negative on this particular topic, so by all means, go ahead.
The principle involved here is not complicated. Committing aggression is wrong. The only time force is morally justified if it's used defensively against actual aggressors. Force used against categories of people based on what you think some of them might do is always the excuse for statism, and it's always immoral. Now, most advocates of closed borders, and I realize Christopher isn't calling his position closed borders, most people who advocate that advocate something different than what we're arguing today. Most openly say they want taxpayer-funded enforcers of the state, keeping people outside of the arbitrary line made up by politicians, known as national borders. That's not the argument today, so I'm just going to address what he actually argues. He says he doesn't want taxes involved. He doesn't want government funding it. He doesn't even want government agents to be the ones enforcing it. Here is the resolution. You already heard it from Eric, but I'll repeat it again. It is sometimes justifiable to use violence to force some people off or keep some people off of everywhere in a country where the state has developed or improved upon the land, end quote. Christopher is saying that's the case. I'm saying that's not the case. Now, about that position, I'm going to prove 4 different points today. Number one, the issue of morality. There are basically 3 main excuses for this immoral position, and it is inherently immoral. One excuse is advocating evil because the world isn't perfect. Well, in a perfect world, we wouldn't need this, but because it's imperfect, I'm going to advocate this violent aggression. That's not an excuse. That doesn't make it moral. And when somebody says, well, what I really want is A, but because we don't have that, the next best thing is this immoral thing over here, that's still immoral, and that's still advocating immorality and injustice. And another way to say a very similar thing is, as long as that evil is happening over there, then I condone this evil over here. Like a lot of people who oppose open borders say, as long as there's a welfare state, we need to keep the borders closed. Now, I'm going to throw in a thing about the fact that closed borders is a euphemism. There's not just a door. Closed borders, again, I'm not saying Christopher is arguing for closed borders. He calls it anti-open borders. Closed borders is a euphemism for the use of violence to keep people from stepping across a line. Open borders just means not using that violence to stop people from crossing a line. Now, another excuse often used to pretend it's moral to use violence for this, people like to call me a purist as if that's an insult. If somebody has principles until they get scared, that's called not having principles. If you say, I believe in non-aggression, I believe in self-ownership, but this is a crisis, this is an emergency, blah, 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 it means you don't believe in those things. You don't believe in the non-aggression principle. You don't believe in self-ownership. If you throw out exceptions as soon as you get scared, that's not a principle. That's just something you kind of hope is going to happen. But if, bad things happen, then that's out the window. Third excuse is the ends justify the means. If we don't do this, then a whole bunch of foreigners come in here and we have more statism. And the whole thing of in the long run, this will be better, that is an ends justify the means argument, and it's totally bogus. It is unquestionably true that if we murdered 7 billion statists, afterwards the people who are still alive would live in a freer society. That does not mean it's okay to murder 7 billion statists. And committing aggression in the name of freedom is hypocritical and insane. Second thing I'm going to prove is that anything that is not open borders necessarily involves violence and is necessarily anti-libertarian. We're going to get into some of the issues about private property rights and the attempt to use the excuse of private property rights to justify these private borders, as some people call it. And we'll get into the specifics of why that automatically makes no sense. It relies on the notion of collectivized property, which, interestingly enough, is called communism. And people complain at me for being a communist for opposing that. But anyway, we'll get into the specifics of that. Half a continent isn't anybody's private property, and having or anti-open borders violates the private property rights of everyone inside who wants to trade or interact or invite people in or deal with people on the other side of that arbitrary line. 3, the position is necessarily statist. I understand that Christopher is saying he doesn't want government involved, but this is a lot like anarcho-communists when they say, we don't want a government, we just want a big thing that makes sure people have what they need and make sure everything, that's called a government. And when you have a class of people against whom you're saying force is justified, all these people who don't have permission to be here, 7 billion or so of them, it is impossible to implement that without a centralized authoritarian government. And calling it something different doesn't make it different. This position is necessarily violent. Violence is the default, and you have to prove your innocence by having a piece of paper shows the papers to show you have permission to be here. That is inherently statist, regardless of what you call it. And it's not just statist against those dad-burn foreigners we're supposed to be scared of. It's statist against everybody, including you and me. Because if we need permission or we need proof that we're allowed to be here, that means we need a piece of paper too. And the default is we get to use violence against you unless you can prove that you have permission to be here. That is inherently collectivist. It is inherently authoritarian. It is inherently statist. Fourth thing I'm going to prove is that the position is intellectually dishonest. It is not the result of somebody looking at the evidence, looking at the situation, applying principles, and seeing where the conclusion leads to. It is the result of people starting with the conclusion they want to reach, which is we want an excuse to violently keep everybody else really far away from us, and then concocting a contorted rationalization to try to make that okay. And I'm going to demonstrate that through very simple questions that show this is not the result of principles. This is the result of arbitrary distinctions, not even bad principles. It's the result of making up arbitrary distinctions to make an excuse for widespread violence and statist authoritarianism disguised as libertarianism. In the closing of my opening, what I wish were the case, or what you wish was the case, the way you wish the world was, what you prefer, what you worry about, what you're scared of, even if you have good reason for it, for wishing for that or being scared of this, doesn't give you moral permission to initiate violence. It doesn't give you permission to be an aggressor. That is what it means to be a libertarian, to be a voluntarist, is that you understand no matter what you wish things were like, you own yourself and nobody else. You own your own property. You don't own half a continent. You don't own the world. Freedom results in some things happening that you don't particularly want and I don't particularly want. The moral position is to allow that unless and until there is an actual aggressor. And then, because people will say, well, what do you do about all these scary things? When there is an actual act of aggression, defend against it, however you want, individually, organized, whatever. Exercise the inherent right of self-defense. And some people have complained to me and said, you mean we have to wait until somebody's committing aggression before we can act? Yes, that is what it means to be a moral human being. You don't become an aggressor based on something that you think somebody might do. You don't become an aggressor and try to paint that as self-defense. It's not. Anything other than open borders, which just means not initiating violence against people stepping over that line, anything other than that is necessarily immoral, anti-libertarian, and statist.
Awesome. Okay, now the floor is now yours, of course. Chase, you have 10 minutes to give your opening statements.
Awesome. Thank you, Larken, for that very lively and impassioned introduction. So I just want to reiterate again that both Larken and I absolutely agree that the ideal solution to the issues here is the complete privatization of everything referred to as public property and the elimination of the state. Now, the crux of the debate, again, just to clarify, is on the question of whether or not what's mistakenly referred to as public property is in fact the private, albeit diffuse property of the people who's been extorted from to develop it, i.e. the taxpayers, net taxpayers, and other victims of the state's aggression. Or if it should be considered unowned. Now, Larken says it should be considered unowned. I say it should be considered the private, albeit diffuse property of the state's victims, and that they have superior claim to those who have never been aggressed against by the state in question or haven't been extorted funds to develop what they call public property. Now, unlike a lot of border proponents, I'm not talking about banning a demographic of people like Muslims or gays or whatever else. My class of people that I want to have restrictions on is not arbitrary. It is referring to people who don't have a claim to what's considered public property, aka non-owners. Now, the other thing that makes me different is that anyone the state has aggressed against, I believe, at least has some claim to what is mistakenly referred to as public property. Anyone, whether this is a victim of the domestic drug war or a victim of the foreign war and terror, they have some restitutive and private claim to what is mistakenly referred to as public property. Now, again, I think developed public property is what needs to be at stake here, because what's virgin property, that is property that has been unimproved or untouched and is still in a state of nature, has not been homesteaded. And because it hasn't been homesteaded, this would be correctly identified as unowned. So I think Larken and I would agree there. But developed public property, which has been homesteaded by agents of the state and has only been able to do this homesteading through the funding of the taxpayers, should be considered the private property of the net taxpayers and the restitution for those who have otherwise been victimized by the state via aggression. Now, I know that he will claim that this is a collective/communist paradigm or ownership that I'm creating here, but it's not. In fact, it's much more akin to like a corporation. This is because it's not like collective ownership in a socialist sense, because there are a very specific and set number of individuals who are owners, and they are exclusive owners, because exclusion is an inherent and necessary part of ownership, meaning that they have property rights to these goods, whereas others do not, and all of their claims aren't equal. People who pay more in taxes on net have a greater claim to it than those who pay less, and people who've been victimized by the state in other ways have more of a claim than those who've been victimized less. So there's unequal claims as well, which also makes it very unlike a socialist sense. Now, the next best solution, because we know the best solution is full privatization, the next best solution is to adopt an invite-only immigration policy. And invite-only immigration policy says that we should only let the people who do have a legitimate claim to what's mistakenly referred to as public property, we should only let them determine who can come or not come based on a valid invite, based on their invite. So if they can invite them, they can come. So this is a very decentralized solution, because it takes the decision away from the central state, as opposed to doing a one-size-fits-all open state border policy, and places it into the hand of those who have individual legitimate claims to what's referred to as public property. This is very decentralized, and it's also the most consistent with libertarian principles of justice, because we're saying those who have the superior claim owing to their status as victims of the state or people who've been extorted by the state to develop goods are the ones who should make the decisions about how the property is used, not those who have no claim whatsoever. Now, another condition of this, however, would be that because each individual who has a claim, they're having to contend with the preferences of all the other joint owners, joint private owners, other taxpayers, other victims of the state, that it wouldn't be the case that one of these people can invite anyone and everyone who they wanted to without assuming any liability. So we're put in this default position to where we have to sort of kind of predict what we think the general consensus of the people who do have legitimate claims to what's called public property, what they may want. And this is to a degree speculative, but what we can say with almost certainty is that what they wouldn't want is for there to be the case where anyone and everyone can come and use the property as they see fit, and any inviters who invited them shouldn't be held liable for any damages they may incur while they're staying. So what I propose to that is that whoever invites a foreign visitor needs to take out liability insurance on them. So in the case that this foreign visitor does happen to commit aggression against other people or their property, there can be some assurances that the victims will be indemnified or compensated for their damages. Now, again, like Larken already acknowledged, I do not want the state to be involved in this policy. What I do want is for the state not to interfere with the legitimate owners of what's called public property from defending it against trespassers. And yes, as soon as someone trespasses against private property who has no claim to that property, that is in itself an aggression. So yes, I am taking the principled stance here. And in fact, I think my stance is even more principled and more in line with libertarian justice. So when they trespass, aka commit aggression, this does give us the right as private owners to evict that person. Now, the open borders policy does entail violence, whether on part of the state or a third party, because what it says is everyone has a right to use what is called public property. And what this means is me as an actually legitimate claimant to this public property, if I try to evict a trespasser who has no claim, zero claim to it, then that means that force can justifiably be used against me in the eyes of these open border proponents, because they think everyone has equal right to use this property as they see fit. And this is also, ironically, the socialist policy, the open state borders one. It creates a tragedy of the commons, because it says, on the first hand, we're going to aggressively preclude any private owners from privatizing this land or these goods. And then these people are saying, but we, at the same time, even though that they're being aggressively precluded from privatizing this, we want to open access up to everyone. And if no one owns something that's being prevented from being privately owned, then everyone owns it essentially. And that is socialism. That is the tragedy of the commons. And we can see how ridiculous this becomes when we apply it to things like hospitals and public universities and schools and parks, etc. Now, finally, my last thing is that this is also a act of forced integration. You're allowing people in who have no claim to this property or an inferior claim, who aren't invited, who aren't wanted, who the people who are the claimants, they do not want them in. They have not invited them. That's forced integration, and that's their property. And forced integration is just as bad as the preventing people from associating with whom they want to. And that's all I have for my opening statement.
Awesome. So in the next round, of course, you guys are going to be able to respond to a question that I'm going to ask you guys, and you each have 5 minutes to respond to said questions. We, of course, are going to start with you, Chase. I would like your thoughts, definitely for our viewers' sake. To those that say that your position is, I guess, inherently violent, more violent than the what others consider the more default position, and that is open borders. What do you say to those guys that say your position is inherently more so statist because it requires some type of border enforcement, that of which if somebody crosses said line that obviously separates nation states, if they cross that said line, they will obviously, if they're restricted in some way, shape, or form, they will be met with some type of force. What do you say to those that say that your position is more so inherently violent as opposed to the opposite?
Well, I can't say if it's more or less violent. What I can say is that it is less statist. It is not involving aggression. It's no more statist or aggressive than somebody evicting trespassers from his his private property that he owns exclusively by himself. Again, there is such a thing as multiple people having a claim to one and the same plot of land. And this means that's their private property. And this means that relative to people who aren't one of those joint owners, they have a superior claim and that they can evict uninvited trespassers, because uninvited trespassers are committing aggression by trespassing. It's very simple.
Awesome. Well, that was very, very quick. To you, Larken, I wanted to kind of ask the same question, but on the opposite side, because those will, and you and I have kind of talked about this, or you've maybe seen the comments about it, regarding the whole open border policy, in which the government border policy, and Chase kind of mentioned that in his opening statement, in which they essentially monopolize the border to allow free access. So regardless of which position it is, be it closed or quote unquote open, and so as long as the government controls it, the prevention of privatization is still there. So there are those that will say your position is inherently communist or socialist because of that. What do you have to say to those?
It's a massively intellectually dishonest thing to say. Mm-hmm. To say that not pointing a gun at somebody when they step over a line equals forced integration is absolutely false. It is a blatant falsehood. To say that using government force to redistribute wealth, that's force. But to say that not using force is violence, and to say that using force is somehow more libertarian, it makes no sense. And when you talk about the government doesn't let us evict them. First of all, later on we'll get into why this notion of we all somehow collectively, but not really collectively, own all the public land, that is inherently bogus and it's inherently communistic. But based on that claim, saying that, well, the government won't let us evict them, even if you had the right to evict them, to say that violence against you therefore counts as not using violence against the guy stepping across the border is now violence makes no sense. It's the exact same dishonest argument that leftists do when they say, well, I'm susceptible to gun violence. So if you don't go along with my calls for gun control, you're responsible for the violence against me if somebody attacks me. Because, hey, if the end result of not using this state violence is that I get victimized, then that lack of violence counts as violence. That's irrational and it's dishonest. Yeah, this is just a slightly more involved version of a question I asked him before, but I'll let him answer it again instead of sort of cheating and using his past answer. Exactly what violence, in the context of what we're talking about, exactly what violence specifically do you think is justified, and against whom specifically?
Violence is justified against people who commit aggression. Aggression can include acts of trespass, in which maybe the person who trespassed maybe didn't physically hurt the person there, or maybe didn't actually vandalize some property, but the act of trespass in itself is considered an invasion and a violation of property rights, which is an aggression. So violence is justified to use against all aggressors, whether they're mere trespassers or thieves or people who commit rape and assault.
Which violence? Trespass.
I think you can use as much violence against someone as it takes to evict them from your property, or as it takes to stop them from issuing violence against your person or your other goods.
Evict them from what property?
Excuse me?
Evict them from what property? That's what I was asking for specifics.
From your private property.
We're not talking about private property.
Well, that's the whole crux of the debate here, is I view what is falsely labeled public property as, in fact, the private, albeit diffuse property of those who have been extorted by the state through taxes or otherwise victimized by the state through other forms of aggression. And that because they have had this experience with the state, that they have a greater restitutive private claim to what's mistakenly referred to as public property than those who have paid no taxes to the state and who have otherwise not been aggressed at against at all by the state in question.
Okay, but you're only including developed land, so it isn't a matter of
That's right.
them from the nation. Like if they walk 20 feet off the road, the public road into the woods where it's undeveloped,
Yeah.
can you evict them any farther than that, or is that?
Yeah, I mean, that's not your property anymore, so they're not on it. So
Okay.
it's unowned. So that's fine.
Yeah.
As long as they're not on your property anymore, that's fine. You evict them away from your property.
Awesome. Well, 5 minutes was just about to wrap up anyway. Now it is your turn, Chase. Of course, if you have a question for Larken, he has 5 minutes, of course, to respond.
Yes, I think the question is pretty predictable. Larken, why don't net taxpayers and other victims of state aggression have a superior claim to developed so-called public property than those who are never taxed or otherwise aggressed against by the state in question?
The question assumes a lot, because the superior claim, if somebody steals my money, they owe me that money. I agree with that. However, it isn't just my money sitting somewhere on a table. It's, for example, a road somewhere that I didn't ask to be built. I had no involvement in the decision. I was robbed, as most of us were for a lot of our lives, to fund the thing. The question isn't about the superior claim is just sort of a nice euphemism for having an excuse to use violence to not let somebody else use it. And so it's another one of those terms that isn't getting to the specifics of what you're actually condoning. And when you talk about the several 100 million people having a superior claim, and this is the first time I heard you say like different people having different amounts of claims. So if somebody else paid $3 more than me in taxes, do they get to tell me to get off the road? It doesn't. The fact that the amount that somebody robbed me doesn't justify my use of violence to kick somebody off of property that I didn't homestead, that I had nothing to do with that planning. Nobody homesteaded it. Government built a big ass road through it with stolen property, and to use violence to keep people off of that is immoral. It's an immoral act of aggression. And to pretend that that's private property makes no sense, because there isn't such thing as several 100 million people privately own something that none of them has a specific say in how it's used. And I will demonstrate that by saying this. I hereby give everyone in the world permission to use the interstates that I was robbed to help pay for. There, did we fix it?
No, if you were listening to my opening, you would see that the inviters would also have to assume some sort of liability insurance for the invited. And I don't think you can afford the insurance premiums for 700 million people, so I don't think that would be an authentic invitation. However, as far as homesteading is concerned, homesteading only requires the physical transformation of previously unowned goods, things that are in the state of nature. The state has done this, but as you and I agree, it is not the legitimate owner. But there is an owner, and the owner is those who had to provide taxes in order to actually enable this homesteading. And not just those who provide taxes, but net taxpayers. And also people who are owed restitution because they're otherwise victimized by the state. Now, yes, I agree. Ideally, the restitution would include whatever it was that was stolen from them, plus maybe some extra for their inconvenience and violation in the interim. However, the state doesn't have all the money that stole from us. What it does have are lots of assets. So barring the perfect restitution, which might be the money that was actually stolen plus interest, it would be better to give people some restitution than nothing. And you're going to be able to provide much more restitution to many more victims by assigning people claims to actual what's called public property or state assets. That's a much closer approximation to what's libertarian justice than saying, no, I think everyone and anyone should be able to use these goods regardless of any link to the state, regardless if they were victimized by the state or had to give taxes to the state. They should have equal access and right to these goods as people who were victimized.
Awesome. 5 minutes just completed. Now we're going to move into the next more so lightning round, in which we're going to be doing a lot of back and forth, but all in all, you're going to have 5 minutes to respond to whether it be your contestants or your opponents' statements. But I would like to pop it off with a question, and I want to start with Larken, and then we'll kind of go from there. Is it your position, and if you could, definitely, because I see the comments, kind of going wild right now about this topic. Do you feel as if it is, and please do correct us and everybody that's involved if this is correct, do you feel as if nobody has, I guess, a higher claim on the property that, obviously we're talking about the border right now, you feel as if nobody, whether it be taxpayers, non-taxpayers, nobody has a higher claim to that said property that was seized, monopolized, that we call, again, a border?
I think the term higher claim is inherently inaccurate and dishonest. Ownership means an exclusive claim, which he mentioned before. There's kind of an inherent problem with that when you're talking about hundreds of millions of people supposedly owning something. This notion of collective ownership, my ownership, I just gave people permission to use it. He then artificially set up a condition of his own that I didn't agree to, that I have to buy insurance for liability if anybody on the road does something bad. That is a complete fabrication out of the blue. I mean, if I invite somebody to my house for lunch and they punch somebody, I'm not the one liable. I'm not the one who committed aggression. So he made that up. And the reason he made that up is because without that, all you need is one person like me saying, I invite everybody onto the roads that I help pay for against my will. And saying it's restitution to give me some say in that makes no sense. In what way is it restitution for me? I got robbed of a bunch of money, but don't worry, now I get to point a gun at somebody and say, don't step on that road. That is not restitution. That is imaginary permission to initiate violence against somebody else. And so there's either a claim or there's not a claim. There's no
such thing as a higher claim, is what you're saying.
Right, unless it's all the way higher, as in 100%, as in it's mine, and that
Correct.
Doesn't work in this collective scenario. This is why communism fails, because to say 200 million people own this section of road, well, what does it mean? To own it means you have the exclusive right to decide what's done with it. None of those 200 million people have the exclusive right to decide what's done with it. Then what you have to do, create government that says, on behalf of those people, we will be the decision makers on what happens on that road, and then you have statism. But there isn't such thing as collective ownership. And the whole notion of communism and everybody owns everything, the inherent logical flaw in that is absolutely applicable in this situation. We can't all own a piece of the road. None of us have the right to decide what's done with it. I can't go set up a tent on it. He would agree, the government would agree, everybody else, you don't get to put up a tent in the middle of the interstate and block the rest of it because it's not mine. And it's not anybody else's because the people who built it with stolen property. So this collective notion of ownership is an immediate logical fail. And, well, I guess that's enough for that.
Okay, well, I wanted to ask you more so the same question, Chase, if you could sort of kind of dive into that, because again, we're talking about and what you've mentioned in your opening statement, as well as some of your responses, Chase, is that, well, you feel as if the taxpayer has more of a higher claim, they're owed more restitution than somebody, again, that's a non-taxpayer. So why is that the case? I want to give you 5 minutes or so to kind of dive into that. Why do you feel as if that is the case in which there is, whether it be collective ownership or not, there is a such thing as a higher claim to someone that was, I guess, robbed as opposed to somebody that wasn't in this here scenario about the border and the state?
Yeah, first, I think either Larken is purposely equivocating or he's unaware of the difference between exclusive and singular ownership. Just because more than one person owns something, like in a partnership at a firm, doesn't mean that it's not exclusively owned. When something is exclusively owned, this simply means that the owners have the right to exclude people from using whatever is owned, and the people they have the right to exclude are the non-owners. It could be 5 owners or 10 owners or 100 owners. But with respect to all the people in the world who are not owners, it is exclusive. So I am talking about exclusive property here. And it's not collective property, again, in the sense of the socialism, because there are a set number of individuals who have a claim to this property. And again, they have differing weights depending on how much they've contributed to it and how much they've been victimized by the state. In fact, the collective ownership mentality is the open borders thing. Because to take this principle home, to drive it to its conclusion, doesn't just apply to borders and traveling. It also applies to all public property, hospitals, universities, etc. If Larkin's going to take the position that no one has a superior claim to these resources, that everyone should be able to access them freely and indiscriminately, then there's no reason why someone shouldn't rightfully be able to set up a crack den in a hospital room, or an alternative healing center, alternatively, or maybe set up a hot dog stand in the middle of a classroom. It doesn't make any sense. We know this intuitively. And I agree that one person doesn't get to decide how the jointly owned private property is handled. But how we do know what's decided, what we need to do is approximate as much as we can what the majority of the shareholders would want. Now, what we know for certain, we may not know exactly what they do want, but we can know with almost relative certainty what they don't want. And what they don't want is for anyone and everyone to use their property however they see fit, have full access to this joint property. Because again, tragedy of the commons dictates that will completely deplete it of all its value, exploit it of all of its value and its usefulness. They don't want that. And for people who do invite others over, they're not going to want the person to be able to invite unlimited amount of people to what's joint property without having any liability whatsoever for the people they invite. We can know that for certain. So what we can't say for certain is exactly what they do want, but we can say that's what they don't want. And a closer approximation to what Larken is suggesting is clearly that they do take on some liability for whoever is invited, and that not just anyone and everyone gets to use this jointly owned property. It has to be by invite. And by invite, that is a very decentralized method of solving this issue. That's not the one-size-fits-all open state border solution. That's a very decentralized. It brings it down to the individual who has a claim to this property. And he makes the invite, and he gets the insurance. And that's about as individualized and decentralized as it can get, short of privatizing the state and eliminating the state completely. Privatizing public property and eliminating the state completely, I should say.
Awesome. Okay. Well, you have, of course, 5 minutes if you wanted to respond to Chase's comments, Larken.
Yeah, it was sort of funny that at the end he claimed that that's the decentralized way after advocating essentially authoritarian democracy by saying the majority gets to decide. Because whenever a number of people co-own something, there has to be a mechanism for deciding, well, what happens to it if we disagree with is there shareholders, is there some arrangement in a corporation, you can own stock, but somebody is making the decisions and you can sell your stock and do that. So you just basically gave a collectivist authoritarian mechanism for deciding, which is the majority gets to decide. That is government, and it's democracy, and it's collectivist. Because if I don't get to decide, so in other words, if I'm in the minority, I immediately have zero say in what is done with that. None at all, because whoops, I got outvoted. Therefore, the individual rights of everybody in the minority just got thrown out the window, including the private property rights. I want to invite somebody from Mexico or something onto my property, but sorry, the majority says and backs it up with violence that they don't get to come up here on the roads built by government that also stops anybody else from building roads. So sorry, you can't come up because the majority said, I'm not allowed to invite you to my own property because the majority of this collective, pretending this is about individual rights when you're talking about a majority of a collective deciding what is done with, vast amounts of pseudo collectively owned property, that is absolutely socialism and it's absolutely statism. Now I've lost track. Are we in the thing where we can ask each other questions? Or?
Absolutely. Again, but you're going to have 5 minutes to. Are you done with that?
Let me respond.
Okay, go ahead, Chase.
Let me respond really quickly. I know it's kind of confusing how I stated that. I'm not saying the majority of people decide, but the majority of shares. Like, for instance, if I own 40% of the shares of a corporation and you own 20%, and then 100 other people own the remaining 40%, then your and my vote could outweigh all of their collective votes. So it wouldn't be the majority of people, it's the way the majority of shares are being directed towards. And again, people who pay more net tax or have been victimized more greatly have a greater say. Now, like you said, like you mentioned, it's not like we're going to be able to have a vote and determine exactly how people want things to be done. So what we need to do is approximate as best we can and treat this illegitimate public property in a manner that we can best approximate will be the will of the majority of shares. Now, what we know with almost relative certainty, we almost know that they would not want all of this joint-owned property to be open and free and indiscriminate access to anyone in the world as much as they want. And we know that this invite stipulation does give all the partial owners a decent amount of rights as far as inviting people who want to come over, but we can say that it's very reasonable that the majority of shareholders would want them to assume at least some extent of liability for the invited foreigners' actions by getting insurance. This assures that any victims of whatever stuff they might do while they're here can be indemnified or compensated. We know for almost certain, though, that they wouldn't want just one partial owner to be able to invite millions of people and have no accountability for what they do whatsoever, have no liability. We know it for certain. So to adopt that policy is insult upon injury because we're purposefully adopting a policy that goes against the wishes of those who do have a superior and legitimate private and restitutive claim to what is mistakenly referred to as public property. We are further victimizing them.
Yeah,
right.
You didn't.
Go ahead, Larken.
I'll do a quick follow-up and then ask the question. You didn't actually fix it because the majority of this big group instead of that big group, it's still democracy. And to say we're approximating what we think most people want means we are forcing our will on the minority. That is collectivist, it's authoritarian. And it is government. When you have a centralized decision-making body that's going to decide how all this public stuff is going to be used, of course, not the way everybody wants it used because that's impossible, you have centralization, you have authoritarianism. What I want to ask is we're talking about like those foreigners who didn't pay taxes. I have a question. How many other people am I allowed to forcibly evict off the road at gunpoint among the following? People who happen to get more checks from or more payments or benefits from the government than they paid into it, or people who have managed to not be robbed by the state, anarchists who managed to not be robbed by the state. Are you saying everybody, yourself, myself, has the right to forcibly chase them off the road because they avoided being robbed by the state? And the last part of the question is, how about you when you drive on a state road in a state where you don't live and haven't paid taxes? Does anybody in that state have the right to point a gun at you and say, get off our road?
Okay, well, first part of the question is, if someone doesn't pay taxes, can someone who does evict them? No, because again, I said not just net taxpayers, but also victims of aggression. And because we live under this statist rule, we are constantly under aggression, because aggression doesn't just include acts of physical force, it also includes threats of physical force. And all the laws that in any way infringe upon our private property rights or liberties are acts of aggression. So yes, because we are constantly and perpetually being subject to acts of aggression, even those who don't pay taxes have a claim, have a restitutive private claim to what's considered public property by the state. Now, ideally, yes, when it comes to people who don't pay any state taxes for, let's say, Massachusetts, then that state property should require that for visitors to come to it, require one of the people who do pay state taxes for Massachusetts to invite them, or who have been aggressed against by the state Massachusetts government. Yes, and again, this goes back to decentralization. We want to decentralize the immigration policies from the federal government to the state, from the people who are aggressed by the federal government to the state, to the county, and ultimately to the individual over his own private, like solely owned property. So yes, this decentralization is absolutely the way towards or closer to libertarian justice. But the one-size-fits-all policy of anyone and everyone can use and access whatever is considered public property as they see fit, regardless of those who are victims have a greater claim to it, that is the centralized state policy. And to say that someone has a right to use something, I wanted to mention this earlier, to say that someone has a right to use something, that means that anyone to stop anyone who tries to inhibit him can have force used against him. So when you advocate this open state border policy, you are advocating violence against those who try to defend against these trespassers and evict them. Because if they have a right, if these foreign invaders, people who have no connection to the state, if they have the right to come in, that insinuates that we don't have the right to evict them. And if we don't have the right to evict them in your eyes, whenever we try to evict them, you think it would be okay to use violence against us for exercising what is our private property rights to evict trespassers. So there is violence on your end too. The question is which side is the justified use of violence or force? That is the ultimate question, because neither side is absent any force whatsoever.
Go ahead, Larken.
Yeah, you're still blaming this act of violence over here and using that to pretend that a lack of violence over here, not pointing a gun at somebody for driving down the road, counts as violence, and it doesn't. I don't exactly understand why you think that if some cop in Florida tasers somebody, that somebody suddenly has a say on who gets to set foot on a road in Hawaii when he didn't pay anything. You added in anybody who's a victim of aggression. That makes absolutely no sense to me.
Well, the cop would probably be a state employee, not a federal. So if a cop tasers you in Florida, the person who's tased, that doesn't give them a claim to property in Hawaii. Maybe it gives them some claim to public property in Florida. So I hope that clears it up for you.
No, it just makes two levels of nonsensical. Okay, someone in the ATF kicks him in the crotch. Now he owns part of Alaska. How does that work?
What? No, he's a state employee. So again, if you're victimized by state governments, you might have some claim to what's considered public property of the state. If you're victimized by federal employees or federal agents, you might have some claim to federal property. If you're victimized by county employees, then you might have some claim to the county's public property.
You only changed the scale of the question. It still makes no sense. So I asked a different question. If
because victims are owed
if someone in the ATF kicks someone in the crotch in Florida, does the guy in Florida suddenly have a claim to some of Alaska?
He has a claim to federal public property. Yes.
From being kicked in the crotch by an ATF agent. That is a very
absolutely, because victims, according to libertarian principles of justice, victims of aggression are owed restitution.
It's not restitution.
The federal government
can be in Alaska. He's not even there.
It doesn't matter, because that is part of the federal government's assets. And because the federal government or its agents are the ones who committed the aggression, then it needs to forfeit some of those assets to its victims. It doesn't matter if it's in Alaska. It doesn't matter if it's right next door. All it's saying is that in principle, that if the federal government and its agents commit aggression against you, you are owed restitution. And the restitution could be in the form of the government's assets, but it can't be in the form of money, because we know the money is being stolen from somewhere else. So we would rather liquidate the assets and use that as restitution.
Well, they're all stolen too.
Well, hold on just a second. Because what we're going to do, we're going to move into the next, obviously, this kind of 20-minute free form, because it's starting to get that way. But I wanted to pop it off with a yet another question to kind of get us going. This is more so I like to start with you, and you can take as much time as you need, Larken. But why, should people who haven't, let's say, been victimized by the state have the equal claim and the equal access to like state control resources, as opposed to, again, those who are robbed and victimized by the state?
Well, he made up something I don't actually believe in and hasn't actually said. Like, if it's an example of a hospital, that's not about open borders. That's about using this resource over here. I still don't think it's publicly owned, but it's actually a different discussion, because the thing of borders is, does somebody get to walk from point A to point B? I don't think everybody has the right to barge into a hospital. Now, nobody legitimately owns that, and that's why you get into the problem of collective ownership, which is an immediate disaster. It's why communism never works, because to say everybody owns it and we disagree on how to use it, it is impossible to solve it with the notion of everybody owning it. I don't think everybody has the right to barge into a hospital paid for by government theft. And also, there's, what good would it do unless you're having to force people to work for you, doctors and nurses and stuff. But I'm just talking about travel. I'm just talking about stepping over the border. It's not, the border issue isn't about who gets to use this hospital. I mean, I would even, if somebody said, I'm going to stop anybody from going into this welfare office, I would say, yeah, I'm not sure I could even argue with that, because they're going in to get stolen loot. However, when somebody says, I want to walk from here to here, and somebody says, I get to point a gun at you because I got robbed by the politicians, that is aggression. And it's not, you can't pretend that that's your property when it's collectively diffused to the point that nobody has a say, until you create some centralized decision-making thing, which will be called government, because that's what it will be the moment you say, well, we need a policy of this thing that will try to approximate what the majority, who the hell is going to be the one to approximate what the majority wants? It's going to be government. And then forcibly impose that on everybody else. And what the minority wants, screw them. They lose out. You can call it whatever you want, but that is centralized government.
So to follow up with that, do you not feel as if, again, people that aren't victimized by said state-controlled resources, or to pay for those state resources, do you feel as if they do or do not have an equal claim to that?
They have the right to move. They have the right to go where they want, because the government built a monopoly and doesn't let other people do it. Right. So to get from point A to point B, they have to trespass on the roads built by the government. No, they don't magically have a claim to everything that the government makes, every building, every library, every hospital, every anything else. Nobody does. That's the problem with collective ownership, is it immediately fails. It doesn't work. You can't have anybody having any legitimate claim on it at all. And so it doesn't work for the reason communism doesn't work. There's no such thing as everybody owns a thing. There's going to be deciders who decide what gets done with it, and they're the real owners, because that's what it means to have the exclusive right to decide what's done with it.
Right.
But as far as the borders issue, that's just a matter of movement. Mm-hmm. Is you don't get to go from here to here because government robbed me to build a road. That is an act of aggression. To forcibly stop someone, but like, I didn't ask you to build this road. I'm just trying to get from here to here, and I can't any other way.
Right.
Now, it is interesting that he accepts that, like, if we implemented his policy, I would be perfectly happy with it, because what would happen is immediately there would be a network of roads that aren't government. Of course, government isn't going to allow that. But okay, if I can't go down this road, I'll step off to the side, walk through the woods a little bit, and then somebody will pick me up in their car. Of course, that isn't even about borders. Like, the border he's talking about defending goes like this. It's not the outline of the country. It's this random collection of different levels of government-created roads and buildings and this and that. The other thing, so he's not even anti-open borders. He's anti-setting foot on property that was improved by government. Which makes it sort of confusing, but
okay, absolutely. And I'm gonna let you kind of answer that, but I wanted to kind of follow up with a similar question to kind of give you a reminder, Chase, because you've obviously been taking the opposite side, which is that they maybe don't. Let's use like the U.S. border between Mexico. Maybe people that are in Mexico don't have an equal claim to, let's say, state-controlled resources in Texas. So why is that the case, though? Because like Larken has mentioned, we're discussing the border, and this person can't cross over this. And obviously, if you restrict them in any sort of way, then it's use of force. Now, what you are saying is that this is justifiable. Why is that the case, Chase?
All right, let me clear it up. Okay, it was very clear from the outset. I never claim that I'm for restrictions on what is referred to as the United States border. What I am for is saying that people can use force to evict others from what's considered public property, developed public property that's been developed by the state. That was the resolution. And the boundaries aren't arbitrary. The boundaries are specifically the parameters of this developed public property. If it's the hospital, it's the property the hospital sits on, the parking lot in the hospital itself. If it's a school, it's the same situation. If it's a road, it's the road. These aren't arbitrary borders. They are directly pertinent and relevant to the actual size and scope of the developed property itself. Now, it's interesting that Larken says that he is against just anyone, everyone using hospitals, because unlike what he'll tell you, there's absolutely no principal difference between not letting just anyone and everyone use a public hospital or a public university or a public school. There's no principal difference between that than saying that they can't trespass on this public road. There's no principal difference. I mean, there are technical differences. One's traveling on a road and one's seeing a doctor in a hospital, but the underlying principle is the same, which is Larkin is saying people should have unrestricted access to public property. He's arguing the negative, saying that it's never okay to use force to evict somebody from public property. Never.
Did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, and my thing is it is. No, I'm not done yet.
Okay, go ahead.
So the other thing is my policy, it is the thing that I'm advocating is as decentralized as it can get. I know it's approximate, but again, the only perfectly justified solution is privatizing everything and eliminating the state. That's off the table. So we're forced to be put in a position, if we're going to find the next best solution, to approximate. And what we know for certain is not the next best solution, which is probably in the opposite end, is that the people who do have a legitimate claim to what's falsely called public property, that those who are the private, albeit diffuse owners of this property, that they would definitely not want just a policy of anyone and everyone using this. Definitely not. Absolutely not. I mean, no one who owns land jointly with somebody else is ever going to be okay with a situation to where, yeah, anyone, you can invite anyone you want to, or anyone can come even without an invite. And even if you do invite somebody, it doesn't matter how many people you invite, you shouldn't be held liable for any damages he does while he's here whatsoever. No one would actually agree to that. So even though we might not know the exact thing that people would want, the majority of shares would want, we do know what they don't want. And to talk back to his claim before about imposing something on a minority, his solution is a one-size-fits-all solution, open access. That is also imposing a solution on everyone. But the difference is his is most definitely going to be against the will of the vast majority of who do have a legitimate claim to this public property, whereas mine might be against the will of some who have minority shares in this thing. So obviously his is more of a deviation from libertarian principles of justice than I am. Again, we're talking about next best solutions, not perfect solutions. And finally, where was I at? I think that's a good place to stop.
Go ahead, Larkin, if you want to respond to that.
Okay, first of all, when he says there's no fundamental difference between someone using a road and someone using a hospital, it ignores the entire concept of freedom of movement. For example, if somebody owns property here, somebody buys a property around them and says, you don't get to step on my property, haha, now you're my hostage, I'll let you go across my property for $1,000 each time you cross it, that is unjustified. It's actually an act of aggression, which is why there forever has been the concept of right-of-way, where I can't get anywhere unless I go from here to there. And to leave that out as if, well, roads, hospitals, same thing, is to say nobody can travel anywhere, because even if you don't go on the road, you have to step across it. And according to him, no, you can't even walk across my road because you didn't pay for it, which necessarily drastically limits the ability of movement of everybody involved. The last main thing I wanted to ask is, I'm dying to hear him describe specifically the implementation of this in a way that doesn't sound like police state authoritarianism. Because basically you're saying, well, people need an invite. If you're a foreigner, you need a written invitation. We'll have a central thing, a central registry that says who has a written invitation. So that the default is I can go up to somebody and say, well, you look kind of foreign. Come on, let me see your papers. And if you don't, I have the right to forcibly evict you from the road. The default isn't, I assume you have the right to be here. It's, I assume you don't. Not only would that apply to foreigners, it would apply to everybody else. I have to prove I'm a citizen or a taxpayer or a victim of the ATF kicking me in the crotch. This entire notion of having papers that prove you have the right to set foot anywhere on any of these roads or have any movement, please explain to me how the whole process of Z-Papers is going to be implemented in a way that isn't centralized authoritarian government. if you have to prove you have the right to go from town A to town B, whether you live here or you're a foreigner.
All right, cool. Well, first of all, I'm sure that none of us would disagree that if you're a member of a country club, let's say, that it would be outside of the realm of it would be outside their property rights to say, okay, if you want to be a member of this country club, then we're going to have to be able to verify that you are actually a member if we're not sure. You know, maybe that's inconvenient. Maybe that's, maybe you might view that as some sort of invasion of privacy. But that's perfectly in line with their private property rights. And a country club, again, is something that there's many members to. So the same thing that can apply to public property. Now, I don't have to sit here and list off all the technical details for how it would function. If I could do that, I wouldn't be a capitalist or a free market anarchist. I'd be a statist because I'd be centrally planning. Just like I don't have to prove how the cotton will be picked if we stop enslaving people and making them do it. What I can say, however, is that in principle, that only those who are private property owners have the right to use what they own, and those who are not the private property owners do not have the right to use it without the owner's consent. They also don't have the right to trespass. And going back to your hospital thing, the point of contention for debate was, is it ever justified to use force to keep someone out or to kick someone out or to keep someone out of public property? And you're arguing the negative. So that would also include hospitals. Public hospitals are public property. And I'm saying, yes, it can be justified to kick someone out. And you're saying yes, too. So you're contradicting yourself. The whole thing about easements and rights of way is a distraction. And that's not even about what the resolution is about here. But yes, you're talking about encirclement. And yes, easements do need to be considered in rights of way. But that's irrelevant, because not everyone in the world has an easement on these public roads. Who may have an easement are people like us who've been using them, but not people who've never been here, never used our roads, never paid taxes, never been victimized by the state in question. So even according to your easements and rights of way stipulation, that still wouldn't apply to what we're talking about. Uninvited foreigners who have not been aggressed against by the state nor paid any taxes. So on all counts, you're either contradicting yourself or you're pulling up distractions that have nothing to do with the central theme of debate.
Go ahead, Larken, if you wanted to respond.
To say easements are irrelevant is sort of bizarre, since the entire conversation is, can people cross over and move around? And you completely dodged the question about what is the implementation of this. Basically, you advocate centralized authoritarianism, say, well, I'm not going to decide the specifics. You advocate, and you wrote this in your article, that people have to have a piece of paper showing that they have a formal invitation to be here. Presumably, that would require the people who live here to have a different piece of paper to say, I live here. And to say, well, I don't know about the specifics, you're still advocating centralized control and violence by default. I get to use violence against you unless you can prove to me that you have permission to be here. Oops, I forgot my piece of paper. Sorry, you get violence used against you. That is not libertarian. That is not voluntarist. That is not moral. And you can't describe a system in which this is enforced at all, which is why you totally ran away from the specifics, without describing a centralized police state where anybody at any time can ask anybody to show their piece of paper proving they have the right to be here. And your analogy to the country club shows the centralization and the authoritarianism in your mind. This is not a country club. I was born here. I didn't choose to come here. I didn't choose to join a club. I didn't choose to get robbed by the state, unlike paying dues to a country club. That analogy is very illustrative of the way you think about things, which is this is giantly collectively owned, because a country club is privately owned by the people at the top who make the decisions. You view this country as all the property of the decision makers at the top, and if you don't have your piece of paper proving you have the right to be here, then violence against you is okay. There is no way to implement the policy you're talking about without it being completely fascist and violent.
All right,
Go
cool.
ahead, Chase.
So, yes, I know that you didn't actually choose to live here, but you're still beholden to the terms of use that are dictated by who are the actual private property owners. And
I am one.
the majority of shares of this property ownership to what's referred to as public property says that we want to institute a policy to where you need to carry around a piece of paper, or maybe you can memorize a number, or maybe a cell phone, or whatever it is. Again, I don't know the details in advance. But if they say the condition of using this joint property and the majority of shares says these conditions need to be met, then you need to do that, because again, we're libertarians. We believe in private property rights, and private property owners, to own something means to dictate, have the right to dictate under what terms it is to be used by non-owners. Okay, and even in this case, if there's many owners, then the will of the majority shares of ownership overrides the will of the minority shares of ownership. And the only alternative to that is to say that the minority of those who have claims has to override the majority's will. Or in your situation, it's even worse, because what you're saying is that not only does the minority of the property owners override the majority of the shares, but even those who have 0 shares, their will even overrides the majority of the shares of ownership into this private, this public, mistakenly known as public property, but this privately diffused yet owned property. So you're saying that people with no shares whatsoever should override the preferences of those who actually do have a claim. And again, we're not talking about perfect solutions. I know that. We're talking about next best. And yours is almost the furthest thing from next best as it can possibly get. And finally, I didn't say necessarily that anyone at any time could check someone. Maybe this would be delegated to actual organizations who have oversight, like maybe a Minuteman Project or something else. I don't know. It would make sense, though, that they wouldn't want just anyone and everyone to have policing powers over this privately owned areas. They want to delegate to organizations who specialize in these areas, are used to dealing with these foreseeable confrontations and complications, and are able to handle them in a peaceful and efficient manner. That's all I have to say on that.
Okay. I wanted to, because we went from talking specifically about the borders, we started mentioning hospitals and stuff like that. But I wanted to, because we went, you kind of mentioned this, Larken, as well. You touched on this a little bit as well, Chase. But all of us here kind of come from that more so anarcho kind of capitalist line of thinking. So considering that, and I know a great Rothbard kind of quote talking about all of this, and I want you guys to chime in on this, is that it doesn't, if everything was privatized, let's say an anarcho-capitalist model, there's no such thing as, let's say, free access, because everything is privatized. Even if it's loosely regulated, that private property owner still has to invite said individual to use it for that person to rightly, or that group of individuals to rightly be on it. Therefore, it would seem as if movement, that word kept getting used around, and it was used in the comments, this idea of free movement doesn't exist, because it was really at the consent of the property owner, as far as your right to migrate, let's say, onto somebody else's private property. So you guys are both taking both the negative and the affirmative, and I'll start with you on this, Chase. So why is it your position actually seems to mimic that model the most, justly making it more or less libertarian?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate something Larken said before. This debate, the central theme of the resolution, was never about freedom of movement specifically. It was always about whether or not it's ever justified to keep someone off of what's called public property mistakenly by force. Whether or not it's justified to use force to keep them off or kick them out. And that doesn't just limit itself to roads. Now, we can go off on a distraction and talk about right-of-ways. That's a distraction. It's about, in general, in principle, can we justifiably use force to evict people from public property? And my position is yes, if those people have no claim to the public property because they were in no way aggressed against by the state or had to pay state taxes, and that the people who can justifiably use this are the people who do have the claim, who were aggressed against or had to pay the state taxes and that. Now, like you were saying, in a privatized society, everyone knows that there wouldn't be freedom of movement. In fact, freedom of movement isn't even a right. No, it's not an independent right, I should say. No rights exist independent of private property rights, because how you move is dependent upon whoever owns the respective land you're moving on. If it's unknown, you can move as much as you want, but unknown land isn't going to exist very long because someone's going to homestead it, right? So this idea that somehow having unrestricted access to public resources, even roads, even to those who have no easement claim or right-of-way claim whatsoever, because they never lived there, so I don't know why he would even bring that up. Even on those situations, it makes no sense to say, therefore, the next best solution, the best approximation to libertarian justice, is to let everyone have free, uninterrupted access to all these public goods. This is socialist. This encourages a tragedy of the commons. It is so very clearly almost the opposite of what we can approximate these people would want. And yes, doing what we know almost for certain is against the wishes, is fully against these people's wishes, is worse than doing things which are at least a closer approximation. Again, this is a matter of what's closer in degree to libertarian principles of justice, not what is absolutely a libertarian justice, because again, we agree on the absolute perfect solution. We're talking about the next best solution.
Okay, go ahead, Larken. And I wanted to kind of just touch on that because, again, kind of what I was asking you, and I'm asking you now, obviously, Larken, about this whole idea of movement, which seems to be why the default is more so definitely amongst maybe the libertarian community, is that, well, access should be, I guess, free and unlimited when, in terms of public property. So considering the anarcho-capitalist model, which we generally would adopt, there's really nothing that would mimic this idea. It's also nothing that will mimic this idea of just everything will be completely closed off. So why is that the default? And take that into consideration when you answer, I guess, some of Chase's comments, if you will, Larken.
Actually, society has done that forever and will do that forever. Even though I don't at all buy the notion that being born here makes me beholden to the violently imposed approximation of what the majority wants upon me, he's also drastically wrong about that. Most people want to be able to go places without having to ask permission. And I would ask, given what he just said, if there's a rich person who lives here, do you think it's morally justified to buy the property around him and say, you can't cross without giving me $10,000? Everybody, every society in history has understood the concept of we need to be able to move. Yes, we own our own properties, we own our own houses and stuff, and there are different ways to fund and maintain the roads, whether it's just a dirt path or something else. But the idea that, oh no, it won't be like that at all, you're going to need permission from every single person, no society ever does that or ever will. Because do you think any store owner says, well, the first thing I want definitely is for no customers to be able to get here unless they get permission from everybody every step of the way? No, we make common thoroughfares, whether it's walking or building a road or something else, because we do understand the freedom of movement, and that without that, you die. If somebody builds around your property and says, you don't get to cross my property, you starve to death. And people understand that basic thing of the freedom of movement and having, common pathways, whether it's, like I said, whether it's actually a path or a road. So to say everything will be privately owned and you'll have to get the permission of every single person, that isn't how it's ever worked.
Well, hold on. Because again, I asked a question. I just wanted to make sure, and maybe I asked it wrongly. That wasn't what I was assuming. What I was saying is that, again, on the anarcho-capitalist model, when we're talking about everything being privatized, it still is not a free and equal access everybody has to it. Now, I'm not saying that means that everybody will automatically close off their property. Obviously exists differently, whether my house is not the same. It doesn't operate the same as maybe a Walmart where their doors are open 24/7, and me, I don't want anybody on my property. What I was saying is, as far as the anarcho-capitalist model, and what I wanted you guys both to answer. I mean, if we assume that everything would be privatized, there is no such thing that exists as far as you having an equal access to anybody's private property. If everything again is privatized, I wasn't assuming, and maybe I worded that wrong, and I wasn't asking you to even defend that, Chase. And I wasn't asking you to defend it being wide open either, Larkin. I wasn't assuming that everything would be wide open or closed. I was saying is that it's still going to be at the consent and the rules of the private property owner. So what would make whether your position on this be the negative or the affirmative? How does that closely mimic what in our current paradigm with the state monopolizing the border via be open or close it? How does that has that closer to that more so anarcho-capitalist model?
All right, can I respond? So I never ever argued against the legitimacy of easements or right-of-ways. And in fact, easements are a category of property rights. And to take his encirclement example, if someone bought up land around his house and it was previously unowned, then the person who's in the house would have already developed an easement because he's been traveling back and forth of his house. So the encircler would have to respect his right of way. If instead, however, the property around his house was owned by someone else before he moved in, and this guy just sold it to somebody else who's an asshole and not letting him cross, well, people aren't going to buy a piece of property that's surrounded by other property completely without having some contractual assurances and easements written to the contract. Say, if I buy this property, I also want to purchase an easement right off of you to be able to access this property. So this situation he brings up is totally unrealistic and would never really actually occur in a real society. And I've never talked about how the majority should forcefully impose their will on him just because of the majority. No, what I have talked about, however, is that property owners have the right to dictate the use of their property and how others who are not property owners should use it. And in this case, if he's a minority, if it's him and 10 other people which own the property, and let's just assume for simplicity's sake, they all have equal shares of it, and 9 of them say, hey, if we're going to be here, since there's so many of us, okay, let's say it's 100. There's so many of us, we're going to have to reserve the right to have this private agency, they're like security guards, check our membership every now and then if they suspect we're not members. That's perfectly legitimate, even if one of the equal co-owners disagrees. And unfortunately, right now, we're not able to divest our shares and ownership for the state. That would be the perfect solution. We can sell our shares, but we can't now. We have to be owners, joint owners of this public property. So again, the closest approximation to libertarian justice is to try and treat it in a way that's most consistent with how the majority of shares would have it be treated. And we may not know what's exactly the closest, but we know what's almost the furthest, and that is exactly what Larken is proposing the furthest, which is that anyone and everyone can access what is the private property of other victims of the state. They can access it no matter if they're not victims, no matter if they're not taxpayers, so they can access it and use it as they see fit. And again, I just want to hammer this point at home again one more time. There is no principal difference between Larken's objection to restricting people traveling on what's considered public property roads than there is from saying that we should restrict people from entering in a hospital. The same principle he says that foreigners who have no easements or anything, that's not even a question, should have the right to travel on these roads. To say that, the same principle would also dictate that you should let anyone and everyone use public hospitals, public universities, public parks, public schools, public monuments. It's the same underlying principle. So he contradicts himself here. It's a huge contradiction. You need to see that. That's all.
Go ahead, Larkin, if you wanted to respond.
You're just continuing to ignore the concept of freedom of movement. And you talk about easement as if it's always a specific privilege. So if somebody is, and first of all, what a complicated, weird, corporate, fascist world it's going to be where, all right, I'm buying this property. I have to enter a contract with everyone around me to make sure they don't trap me in. It doesn't have to be just one person's property. I better have this contract with all my neighbors to make sure they don't suddenly say I can't go across. And, well, if I've lived here for a while, then I have this easement right of way, but other people don't. So if I want to invite my friend over, I'm not allowed to because he doesn't have an easement to cross that property. That's bizarre. And it comes out again as centralized authoritarianism is pretending it's private property. And you keep making that analogy and ignoring the fact that the analogy doesn't work at all. This isn't a country club. It's a gigantic thing that you're calling private property of taxpayers and then saying a centralized decision-making body that tries to approximate what the majority might want, they get to decide how all of that is handled. That's called government. That's not private property. And to say that you don't get to go from town A to town B unless that deciding body approximates that the majority says you're allowed to go from town A to town B, because there isn't another way to get there. I would quick throw in, no, never will everything be privatized. Already, most things are not legitimately owned because they haven't been homesteaded. Drive across the country, walk across the country, you'll see a bazillion acres of things that aren't private property. And when people make paths, and again, this has been true forever, they make paths to be able to have everybody go from one place to another. It's not, well, I made this path, and here's the list of people that I officially gave an easement to, so you can go from town A to town B. That is never how it's worked. It's never going to be how it works. So that, and again, trying to pretend that the only way you can get from here to here counts as private property as a result of politicians robbing somebody over there without their consent, to compare that to a country club when none of it was voluntary. None of it was organized. I didn't have any say. And to now give me a say in pointing a gun at somebody to say, you don't get to drive down I-95, that doesn't give me restitution. It doesn't fix anything. It just gives a central committee control over this collectively owned, which doesn't work, collectively owned property. And to say that, well, mine is the worst, I'm not saying the minority gets to forcibly control who goes there. I'm saying nobody gets to forcibly control who gets to go from town A to town B. You're the one saying that a committee gets to decide and use violence to enforce their decision, deciding who can go from town A to town B. I'm not advocating violence. I'm saying nobody gets to say, hey, you people in town A, you don't get to go to town B because the majority had a vote and blah, 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 and we got robbed by politicians, and now you're stuck in town A because freedom.
Go ahead,
Okay,
Chase.
That's interesting, because to say that nobody gets to determine who can enter this public piece of public property or that public property, that no one gets to determine that, or who can travel on this public road or not, to say that is a dictum. It's saying that, hey, my policy is no one can restrict anyone's use of this road. And to say that everyone has a right to use that road, the flip side of that, what that entails, is that we can use force against those who try to inhibit others' use of that road. And when we look at this as people who have been taxed and extorted by the state as victims of the state, who, again, have a restitutive and private claim to what's mistakenly called public property, and people who've otherwise been victimized by the state, they have a better claim. And when you enforce your policy that says anyone has the right to use it, what would happen is you would view people who are the property owners, like myself and other victims of the state, when they're trying to limit or restrict the use of this public property, you would say that this foreigner who has no connection to this public property whatsoever, is never victimized, never paid taxes, you're saying that he can justifiably use force against me. That the trespasser, the trespasser can justifiably use force against the person only trying to defend his private property from trespass. And that also, again, like we were talking about, this all goes back to violence. There's violence on either side. The question isn't, is there violence, is there not violence, is which application of violence is justified and consistent with the private property ethic, and which application of violence is out of line, the private property ethic.
You're begging the question. It's not trespassing and it's not private property.
I'm not begging the question. I've explained exactly why it's private property many times.
What you just did was the equivalent of saying, hey, if you're against carjacking, you're advocating violence. Because that means you're saying it's okay to use force to stop a carjacker.
That's right.
Yes, I am absolutely saying it is justified to use force against you if you tried to stop somebody from moving from town A to town B, when he hasn't threatened anybody, he hasn't harmed anybody, you are the aggressor. So yes, force is justified to get you the hell out of his way so he can move from point A to point B.
And I'm saying that trespassers are, by trespassing, by definition, are aggressing, because trespass is aggression, and you have the right to evict trespassers from your property.
It's not your property.
That's where we disagree. And the foundation for your disagreement is a lot weaker than mine, because mine actually shows a legitimate, valid, verifiable connection between those who have been victimized by the state and those who have paid taxes by the state, which is greater than those who have had no aggressive interaction with the state whatsoever. And one last thing I want to say to clear this up, because I haven't mentioned this yet. Those who can actually demonstrate they've had a particular piece of property taken from them by the state through aggression, they should have first and only say. This doesn't apply to them. We're talking about property which we can't trace back to who were the actual owners in the past and who have been aggressed against. It's been lost in time. This is only referring to that property. So that, I know it was a point you made a long time ago, but I just want to make that clear. They have first priority if they can demonstrate a particular connection between themselves and property that was theirs that was taken from them by the state. But for most of the property that we don't know this history of, yes, the superior connection goes to the victims, and they're owed restitution, and they have a restitutive and private claim to the assets of their victimizers.
A quick thing that I also mentioned a while ago that I never heard an answer to. Do you believe it's justified to use force to stop anyone from going down the road if they've managed to avoid being robbed by the state? They live here, they were born here, but they've avoided.
I did answer this already, and because they've always lived with aggression by the state, that also gives them the claim. Because again, they're victims. And even just the threat of force is considered aggression. Again, aggression is defined by the uninvited initiation of physical interference with the persons or property of others, or threats thereof. And all laws we live under are threats of force against us, even that violate our private property rights. So because they are victims of aggression, they also have a claim to these so-called public property, even if they haven't paid taxes, because they're still victims of aggression. And that's included in my stipulations.
The moment anybody sets foot in this country, they're a victim of the threat of aggression. I'm in this country. Okay, what if I want to smoke a joint? No, there's a threat of aggression. By your own. See, here's the problem. You are trying to create a distinction that doesn't make any sense. You are trying to keep out foreigners while pretending it isn't about cultures and nationality and where somebody was born, but the distinctions completely fall apart. Because the moment somebody steps across that line and buys a gallon of gas, they pay taxes. Are they good now? Can they go anywhere they want in the country?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. First of all, and I wrote this in my article too, I don't think that visitors who've been invited should be subject to any taxes whatsoever, because they're not giving any legitimate claim to the actual public property that's there. However, if they are, for some reason, paying taxes, they, unlike us, they chose to come here. They're taking action to come here of their own volition. And they're only being invited, and this would probably be consistent with what the majority of shareholders would want, they're only being invited under the condition that their status as mere visitor remain intact. And any sort of taxes they might pay would just kind of amount to maybe like a visitor's fee of sorts. And so because, again, they're choosing to come here, they are subject to the conditions of the people who already have a superior claim. And that would likely be a condition, because they wouldn't want just some guy who pays a couple dollars in taxes on gas tax to have a legitimate claim to which jointly the property of other victims who are not there by choice, who haven't come there by choice, who are extorted by the state and otherwise victimized by it. Again, I know this isn't perfect, but again, this is a closer approximation to the libertarian principles of justice than saying anyone and everyone can use what is this public property, which is really owed to the victims of the state. Anyone, everyone can use it as they see fit. And that is the conclusion of the principle you're using. Because again,
I know you're about to answer. I know you're about to answer that question, Larken. But I wanted to ask, because I want both of you guys to actually answer this. How do you feel as if your position, whether you took the negative or the affirmative, will obviously start with Larken. How do you feel as if that works towards, I guess, getting towards a freer society, which ideally the land that the state has monopolized is privatized or able to be legitimately, claimed?
The ends don't justify the means, so I'm not going to say that allowing people movement. For example, if a whole bunch of socialists moved into my property and bought property from my neighbors who willingly sold to them, A, I wouldn't like it. B, it would probably result in less freedom for me. And C, I still don't have the right to violently interfere with those transactions. So the idea that the overall good or the overall goal justifies temporary violence is always the excuse for statism, and it's immoral. Whether or not freedom gets a little bit more or a little bit less or anything in between, That, I mean, you can debate that as a factual thing, but it doesn't matter to the principle of the thing to say we're going to condone violent aggression because in the end we think it'll reduce violent aggression. Like I said, if you're going to accept that ends justify the means rationale, then you might as well say, let's murder 7 billion statists. Yeah, it's not very nice. Yeah, it's an act of aggression now. But hey, in the long run, it'll be a freer society. It's still freaking evil. And whenever you condone centralized authoritarian violence or just violent aggression at all in the name of reducing violent aggression, you're a hypocrite. So to me, it doesn't even matter if it goes up or down a little bit. I'm not going to be an aggressor. And people, oh, you're a purist and blah, 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 blah. Yeah, I'm not one of the people violently attacking others and saying it's for the common good. And if you are, and arguing against other people who say, well, I think it's for the common good to steal your money to give to the poor. Well, I think it's for the common good to do this. You have no grounds to argue against them. You've already accepted the notion that some common good justifies temporary injustice and violence, and it doesn't.
Go ahead, Chase.
All right. Yeah, so tragically, me and Larken hold the same principles, NAP, private property ethic, etc. However, I think Larken maybe is unfamiliar with the fact that you can't really divorce principles from practicality. They're one and the same. If a principle is totally impractical, it's probably not a good principle. And fortunately, I have a more correct interpretation of the NAP and private property. I have a more refined understanding of how it's applied, especially in legal situations where there's restitution involved, especially when it's owed by the state. And fortunately for me, I can stick true to my principles, not endorse aggression, and achieve a practical outcome that gets us a lot closer towards our ideal stateless society. I don't have to choose between one or the other. I can have both. And that's what the message that all ANCAP should hear, is that we can have both. We don't have to choose between one or the other. Saying that victims of the state, when we don't know who the public property was originally taken from, we don't know the chain of title, but we do know the state has a lot of assets and it has aggressed against a lot of people, saying that the people who are aggressed against have a claim to that public property, and it's really considered their private property, their joint private property. That is the thing that's in line with the libertarian principles of justice, what's in line with the NAP, what's in line with private property. What Larken is suggesting is something due to an unrefined understanding of the application of these principles, and unfortunately the conclusion he draws is something much more akin to socialism. He's saying, even while the state is forcibly precluding the privatization of these public resources, I think that allowing them to have open, unfettered access by anyone is the next best solution. And that's actually the worst, most socialist solution you can possibly think of. That's going to deny all the true victims of the state the restitution they're owed when time comes to pay. Their joint property will be worthless because they'll be depleted and exploited by all those who did not have a legitimate claim to it, who are not the property owners. And it is those who have zero claim having their preferences extolled above and beyond those who have a claim at all and a greater claim.
Awesome. I'm going to give you one more time to respond, Larken, and then we're going to move into our closing statements.
Okay. Says the guy who advocates demanding people's papers to prove to a centralized authority that they have the permission of the majority approximating deciding who can move where. You keep piling layer upon layer of excuses. So the guy who comes in here and buys a bunch of gas and pays taxes, well, that's just sort of a fee to us. When we pay it, now we're part owners of everything. And there are so many different scenarios that show that the rationality is fabricated and fake and intellectually dishonest. Okay, so now somebody walks across the line into the woods and builds a cabin. Now he's a landowner here, according to you. Now, how much does he have to get robbed before he's suddenly part of this weird collective that you pretend isn't a collective, that owns public property that you pretend is private? There are a million real-life actual scenarios that make the principles completely fall apart. Because no, you're not abiding by the non-aggression principle at all. When the default is, prove you have the right to be here, Mr. Random Person. Prove to the Politburo that you have their permission to be on this road. It is not at all libertarian. It is not at all pro-freedom. But we can go to closing.
Awesome. Well, again, I appreciate both of you guys obviously joining us. I'm going to give you both a total of 8 minutes in giving your closing statements regarding this topic. And for those that have kind of came in later, I wanted to let you guys know what this resolution that we were arguing in the first place was, to repeat it so you understand it in context. And I should have been doing this throughout the debate, but it is sometimes justifiable to use violence to force some people off or keep people off of everywhere in a country where the state has developed or improved upon the land. And Chase obviously took the affirmative, and Larken took the negative. And since Larken, since you opened up, I'm going to let you have the last closing statement. Of course, it's your turn now, Chase. You have 8 minutes to kind of wrap everything up and touch on the things that you touched on throughout this whole entire debate.
Sure. Yeah, again, I just want to remark upon the last thing you said really quickly. Now, as far as the person deciding with his own volition to come over here, again, I've said it time and time again, I don't think foreign visitors should be subject to taxes. So that should be irrelevant. I think they should be exempt from it. That's my next best solution, is to have them exempt from taxes. So the whole idea of them paying taxes, yet what's their claim, it would be avoided if that was followed. That's my next best solution. But again, even if that weren't followed, if he's coming over here, then he's coming over here and he needs to abide by the conditions set by those who were previously acknowledged to be the superior claimants to the property, those who actually own the majority of share in the property. And what we can predict, this isn't a priori true, but we can likely predict is that the majority of shares who own this current joint property would not want people who just are visiting, who just pay a few dollars in gas tax, to have a claim to this joint property themselves. And again, that's why it would amount to visitors' fees. Again, we're all talking about what is the way we can treat the so-called public property in the way that is most in line with the wishes of those who have the legitimate claim. That's what it's all about, trying to treat stuff as close as we can to the libertarian principles of justice, which dictate that we respect the wishes and the will of the private property owners. Now, my closing statements, again, we both agree privatizing everything is the best way. That's the perfect way. That's the easiest way to comprehend. We want to eliminate the state. However, we need to ask ourselves this question. Do we really believe that people who were never aggressed against by the state, who never paid taxes toward the state, which funded its public property, its developed public property, do we really believe they should have equal access as people who did? And do we really want to say that if we do answer the affirmative, then it's justified for us to use force against those who do have the superior claim, who try to exercise the defense of their property by evicting trespassers? Again, trespass is an aggression. No matter how much you want to deny it, trespass is an aggression. And I agree with Larken. Violence can only justifiably be used in response to aggression, and trespass is an aggression. Okay? My view, I don't have to sacrifice principles. My view is the most in line with libertarianism and private property. I'm realizing that the assets of the state are just as valid restitution as anything else. The state doesn't have enough money to pay back everyone's damages, whether they were physical damages or stolen theft. So we have to take what's available. If we're going to approximate justice as closely as possible, we need to use what's available. And what's available to the state beyond money are its assets that's developed. And yes, those should be divvied out amongst the victims. And until it can be divvied out amongst the victims, they should have the say over how it's used and the terms of its use. And again, my suggestion is the most decentralized, because I do want there to be an invite-only policy, that any individual person who has a claim can invite over a foreign visitor. I'm not talking about forced exclusion here. They can invite them over. What Larken's talking about is the most centralized. It's funny, he talks about my central committee. His is the most centralized because it's a one-size-fits-all indiscriminate solution that applies to everyone despite and in the face of their victim status. He doesn't see them as any different than people who are not victimized. They don't deserve any more special recognition. So I don't want the state to enforce this. I want it to be private individuals. My position is I just want the state not to interfere. I don't want the state to interfere with people enforcing their property rights and defending them from trespassers, and I don't want any third parties to interfere with that. I think private property should be sacrosanct, and that being sacrosanct means you can defend it from invaders. And I don't want anyone to try to inhibit this sort of defense. This is an exercise of property rights. What Larken is talking about, again, if he's saying that privatization, he understands that privatization of what's considered public property is being precluded aggressively by the state. The state doesn't let us privatize what's considered public property. He knows that. So to go from that knowledge and then to say, thus we should look at it as unknown and everyone should be able to use it. Well, if no one owns something, that's the very same thing as everyone owning something. And everyone owning something is much more socialist and collectivist and ownership than me saying, no, only a particular set of individuals have ownership claims to it, and only those who've been victimized, and they have claims which deviate in weight according to how much they are victimized, how much they've been extorted. That is akin to like a corporation or a partnership. And yes, if he's going to say that's like a government, maybe it is, but it's not a state. We're not against governments per se, we're against states. And I'm sure he would see the legitimacy of senior partners overriding the will of junior partners when it comes to dictating the policies of a partnership. And so too does that same policy, that same philosophy apply on a grander scale. It's just a grander scale, but it's the same principles. And that's all I have to say.
Okay, Larken, if you want to go ahead and give your closing statements.
Sure. I lost count of how many times you said I want a one-size-fits-all policy. I do. The one size that fits all is non-aggression. And the number of specific scenarios that can be used to show that this isn't principle, this is excuse based on contorted rationalization, is huge. If people walk into the woods and build a cabin on this side of the line, you say that's okay. And then if they build a road up to there, when is that okay? The liability thing that you just pulled out of a hat so that it doesn't work for me to just say, well, anybody, if I'm part owner of the roads, anybody can come in. I'm perfectly fine with that. And the thing of, well, you chose to come here, Mr. Foreigner, then you're saying morality depends on where they were born, as if they chose that. And if you're going to say that, how about somebody who leaves for a week and then comes back? Well, you chose to come back and you didn't pay taxes before. And you still, your answer to the thing of people who avoided being robbed was, well, there's some vague threat and therefore you're the beneficiary, so it's partly yours. There's some vague threat about everybody who sets foot here. So it's manufacturing artificial divisions to try to separate based on place of birth or nationality or all the other things that you're pretending it's not about. But you keep piling layer upon layer of excuses. And the notion of restitution is something that doesn't make any sense because it's not restitution. I don't get part of the road. My restitution, according to you, is I get to threaten somebody for stepping foot on the road. That's not restitution. That doesn't pay me back. Restitution is just another excuse for the aggression that you condone because you want to keep lots of people really far away from you. And instead of just admitting that, you pretend that it's in line with the non-aggression principle. And the implementation of this would just be ridiculous, which is why you didn't get into specifics. For example, the guy in Florida who gets kicked in the crotch by the ATF agent, what does his piece of paper look like? Well, reason that I have claim to some of Alaska is a guy from the ATF kicked me in the balls. Really? How does that get implemented? The answer is it doesn't. It can't possibly. And any attempt to do it would be police state lunacy demanding to see people's papers and saying, well, you can't set foot on this road, but you can be 30 feet off the road. All right, well, we'll build a village over here. Well, what counts as an invitation? And I can't just say, hey, buddy, come on down. No, I have to write out a formal thing and submit it to the Politburo. So he has a piece of paper officially stamped saying that he's allowed. It's ridiculous. It's authoritarian, centralized control freakism, and pretending that that's non-aggression, pretending that's libertarian is just ridiculous to me. The libertarian policy is do not commit aggression. Yes, it's one size fits all. Don't commit aggression. And when you beg the question by calling them trespassers and pretending it's private property when it provably makes no sense to do so, that doesn't solve it. That's you making up something, pretending it's the case, and then arguing from there. It doesn't make any sense. So, yep, I'm all in favor of a one-size-fits-all solution. It's called self-ownership and non-aggression.
Okay, well, again, thanks for both Chase and Larken for joining us here over at Being Libertarian. We got some good feedback, guys, that are, again, we agree on the ideal standard. It seems as though when we get to discussing, okay, how we get there and acknowledging the reality and the scope of what the state does right now, that's when the disagreements come. It was nice to have both of these guys on here with us over at Being Libertarian to give both of their commentary. Of course, you can visit us over at beinglibertarian.com. We will soon be launching beinglibertarian.tv, in which we'll be backlogging a lot of our debates and podcasts and things of that nature, in which you will be able to catch all of those on our website, as well as iTunes and Amazon and a whole lot of different kind of platforms and whatnot. So again, I am Eric July of Being Libertarian. Of course, we had a great debate between Larken Rose and Christopher Chase. Rachels, I hope you all enjoyed yourselves. Until next time, peace.